Welcome everybody. If I could ask you to take your seats, there might be one or two people to come in as we go. My name's Tim Besley. I'll be spending the next few minutes in conversation with Partha, but there will also be an opportunity for questions from the floor. Before I sort of formally introduce the event, let me tell you a little bit about this, what it looks like here and why it's here. So this is an event organized on behalf of the Annual Review of Economics, whose editors Hélène Ray and Philippe Aghion are also in the audience. It's a kind of a part of the attempt, I think, by the Annual Reviews, which publishes a whole raft of journals and has only been going in economics for I think about 16 or 17 years. Was founded by Ken Arrow, who was the founding editor of the economics version. Some of you in the room will have already written for the Annual Reviews in one way, shape or form. But the idea is to have more multimedia style events. So today's event, which in conversation with Partha will appear on the Annual Review website as a self-standing piece. But there will also be a transcript published in the journal. And I think that there's various other outlets that Annual Reviews have. They have a magazine called A Shot of Science where they will showcase bits and pieces of important research. So this is part of that. So the way we're going to run the event today is I'll obviously introduce Partha formally in a moment for the cameras. And then we will talk for a little while and I'll obviously introduce the conversation at the same time. And then at some point, I'll turn to the audience and there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions, and then we'll wrap up in approximately, I'd say, an hour and 5 minutes time. So our guest of honor and speaker this evening is Partha Dasgupta. I think he probably needs very little introduction. I should say he's been a very important economist in my life too. I remember reading his work from an early age as an economist, and as the ratio of our ages converges, I still remember very well reading the classic book with Jeff Heel on natural resources and economics. But then one of my particular favorites was a book I think you published in 1982, Partha, called The Control of Resources. Yeah. One of whose chapters was called The Optimal Rotating Forest, if I remember. And forevermore, I thought of trees twerking whenever I thought of the title. Anyway, that was an important, a very important book. And latterly, you've continued in that vein of work, I know, and that's what we're going to talk about today, culminating in a policy sense in the review, the biodiversity review you did for the British government, and which came out in 2021, and that will be where we'll go in a moment. But Partha's work has been very broad-ranging on poverty, on rights, on population. Actually, when I first came across your work, you were working with Joe Stiglitz on innovation models as well. Huge range of topics that Partha has worked on. But as I say, the focus this evening is going to be on his work on biodiversity. Partha, we're proud to say, is a former member of our department. I think your first job was here, yes, wasn't it, after you graduated yes. from Cambridge? Partha was here for a number of years, and then sadly for us at least, went to Cambridge where he spent the rest of his career. I'm also delighted to say that Partha's wife, Carol, is here this evening, who's a graduate of the LSE. So that's it's always nice to welcome back our former graduates. So without any further introduction, Partha, if that's all right, because I know there's much I could say, but we're really keen to hear about your more substantive views on biodiversity. Yeah. Perhaps you could just begin, first of all, by telling us how you got interested in those issues. What were the gaps in knowledge that really motivated that? And then we'll get a little bit into the framework that you use and have evolved for thinking through those issues.
Well, sure. It's a great pleasure to be here to see you after such a long time. As we all know, people have more than one calling. If it were purely intellectual discipline, I would never have left the LSE. It was far and away the best place to be in. And I went to a far inferior department from here. Far inferior department. But there's several reasons And one of them is pertinent to the question you were just now asked, which is, it is a social science university. And at about 1978, 79, I began to feel, before the Control of Resources was published, about the time I was thinking of writing it, I began to feel that I needed to be in the midst of ecologists. I needed to understand how the living part of natural world works, because even then I realized that economics had taken a really wrong turn and that wrong turn is a reflection of the Enlightenment project itself, the way it had developed, which is to think of the human person as being a blank canvas onto which pretty much anything can be painted. And that's not really right. We are embedded in nature. We have evolved as a species. And many of our seeming behavioral biases might be linkable to the kinds of problems we faced thousands of years ago. That's the evolutionary biology side. On the other hand, I realized that the book that I had written, that you referred to a few minutes ago, the exhaustible resources, they were probably not the primary things of interest to us. I had in mind the idea of ecosystems, although I didn't know the term, by the way. I did know the term forest, even a rotating forest. I knew the term water holes, and that they resonated with me because I was particularly interested in studying poverty and extreme poverty in the Indian subcontinent at that time. And I realized, of course, the world's poorest people are asset managers par excellence. They see their lives as being embedded in their local ecosystem, from which they harvest water, fuel wood, pharmaceuticals, you name it, grazing land, and so forth. So they're concerned with a resource allocation problem as a matter of course, to which they can't articulate it the way we do here, obviously. But that's not the point. They solve these resource allocation problems, and they do it really well because there's no margin of error there. If you're so poor, if you make too many mistakes, you're out. So that's the one reason I moved to a university campus, Cambridge, was that I knew there were good biologists there, and that worked out. So in some sense, I had no real plan, by the way. It's not as though I had an ambition to write the review of the economics of biodiversity. That came 40 years later, so to speak, and out of the blue in some ways. But the control of resources that you just mentioned is a forerunner. You're absolutely right in having picked that up. By the way, the book didn't sell at all. It bombed. I mean, if you talk about a bomb, it sort of sank by the time it came out. But it is still my favorite book because it had chapters which were on these assets. So to complete the narrative of how I came to this field, I read a book by chance called Ecoscience by Paul Ehrlich, Anne Ehrlich, and John Holdren. And I was still at the LSE, this is 1978. I came by it by chance. It wasn't in the bookshop here. And it sang to me, the chapters, it was very non-technical, it wasn't mathematical. And of course, we economists like to model things, to get a sense of the quantitative aspect of any problem. So there was a chapter on forests, there was a chapter on waters, rivers, and so forth. And I kept on saying to myself, am I not reading the same thing, chapter by chapter? And they all looked to me as though they were renewable resources. And of course, Mother Nature is renewable. Spring comes, trees have flowers, and then by the autumn, the leaves fall, and then there's a regeneration over the cycle, the annual cycle. So it seemed to me that we ought to be really concerned with the accumulation of capital of the kind that we study in economics, growth models, an accumulation of physical produced capital and human capital, but we need to embed that entire infrastructure on a finite biosphere. And that's, in some sense, what I was trying to do in the review. But in that book, I looked at each of these these ecosystems one by one. Now, of course, what I was doing was I translated each chapter into a mathematical model. And they all looked pretty much the same. They were self-regenerative resources. How do I know I was right? I didn't, because I didn't know any ecology. But I sent the material to Paul Ehrlich. And he wrote back saying, I don't understand the maths, but I think I smelled the right thing, so to speak. Anyway, so since then, I've been working with ecologists to try and reconstruct economics in the fashion that I've just now described. And before I finish, the reconstruction is not a trivial matter, because it's not just a matter of sticking in a natural resource into a growth model, for example. I mean, that's for sure, you can do that. But it permeates to the household level, from the national economy or the international economy to the household level, for one very important reason, and that's what makes it so have a zing rather than just the dynamics of it, which is much of Mother Nature is invisible and silent. The processes, that is, what goes under our feet. And of course, she's mobile, which creates these externalities, missing markets. Things that you do have consequences in the future, elsewhere, and so forth, and they go missing. And that, the magnitude of these consequences, which are missed out in economic calculations, is today very large. It wasn't very large 50 years ago. 70 years ago, certainly it wasn't very large. One of the things you discover is that the last 70 years has been monumental change. And so if the economics that was constructed after the war by the giants of our field, like Robert Solow, for example, who ignored nature, as a first approximation, it wasn't a bad one. Because at that time, the global economy was very small. But today, that would be a big mistake. And you then have to try and understand the kinds of communities form in the grasslands or in the wetlands or in the rainforest in response to the particular ecosystems they inhabit and the kinds of things they can control. Okay, so that's the reason for all this elaborate work that I was involved in.
Excellent, thanks. So perhaps you could share with us a little bit about the framework that you now use and you used in your review, particularly around the shift from thinking about flows and more about stocks. Something I learned from your work and from actually some joint work you did with Ken Arrow, if I remember. Yeah. So perhaps you could just articulate a bit more for us all how that framework actually fits together and why it's so critical to view things in that sort of wealth-oriented way, perhaps a little bit away from what economists often think is about what is our GDP or our income. You I think, have got a very powerful way of thinking through these issues and with a much more central concept of wealth. So maybe you could just articulate that for us.
Of course. Very happy to. There are two types of welfare questions we tend to ask. We all human beings ask. How are we doing today relative to how we were last year? Or what is next year likely to be? That kind of assessment. Comparison of states of lives, experiences as it moves through time. And a second one is, what should we do? Should I invest in this or should I invest in that? Both are assessments. And it turns out these are the same question. And I'll come back to that in a minute. We tend to use, in a sense, we economists are schizophrenic because when we discuss, say, investment criteria, whether for a company or for a government, we say, well, let's try and estimate the rate of return on the investment, just say. The difference for the private sector and the government would be the kinds of prices you would use to estimate your rate of return. But if you ask yourself what the rate of return is doing for you, it's talking about, essentially, it's looking at the flow of net profits or benefits and then expected from the investment, and then comparing the flow of benefits to the cost of setting it up. But the sum of flows is, of course, the stock. So even although we economists talk about GDP growth, we actually, when it comes to investment criteria, we don't go for GDP. We ask for to say, is the investment likely to increase wealth? Because the present discounted value of the flow of profits is the change in the wealth that the investment will bring about. So even there, wealth comes. And then when it comes to comparison over time, we say, are we better off today than we were yesterday? And we say, well, GDP is higher, or per capita GDP is higher, so we must be doing better. We forget that we are looking at GDP, which is a gross term. It doesn't take into account depreciation of capital. And no household would ever, but ever, ignore the depreciation of capital in their wealth accounting to say, whether are we, what am I paying? Of course, the corresponding thing is that when we pass on our, gifts to our children, it is wealth we are handing over, estate we are giving over, or whatever. So either way, whichever way you look, you're staring at something like wealth. And wealth means the value of all the assets that you have access to, not necessarily what you own, because you have access to public goods which you don't own, but nevertheless they're part of your wealth, because that part which you're using will be part of your wealth. Now, in a sense, it's a extension of the notion of real national income, for which the LSE is famous, because Hicks wrote on national income, real national income, giving a welfare justification for looking at income. But they were concerned with what we economists call stationary states, steady states where relative prices don't change. So there, of course, wealth and stocks and flows make no difference. They're the same. You're just looking at a steady state. But in a non-stationary world, it makes a lot of difference as to whether you're looking at income or whether you're looking at wealth. And wealth allows you to carry with you the idea of all assets that are there at the basis of production and consumption. So the theorems that you were pointing to go as follows. It says, we are concerned with, let's say, national economy, well-being today, well-being tomorrow, well-being day after. It's not just well-being today. Our children's well-being, our grandchildren's well-being, and so forth. It's a kind of a recursive notion of life. And what the theorem says is that no matter what conception of well-being you take, it doesn't matter whether you're utilitarian, whether you're a Buddhist, or whatever conception you have which which accommodates the future people, your own descendants, say, and others' descendants, then corresponding to that, there is a measure, we can call it wealth, such that if over time wealth increases, then well-being increases. And if well-being increases, wealth increases. There's a complete correspondence between the two. And the connection between well-being and these assets is the prices that you use to measure the wealth. So it has a complete, full grounding in moral thinking, the notion of wealth.
But how do we get to that? Because I assume in the next few weeks we'll get the latest GDP numbers from our government.
Yeah.
And that, for you, would be a very alien way of thinking about whether there's been progress, say, quarterly GDP growth or whatever they might choose to look at. But it sounds like what you're advocating, if one takes the findings of your review, is a real mindset shift in the way we would report measures of economic progress. So how exactly would you see that working? Is that meaning that statistics authorities just have to develop totally new measures, or do you think it's really tweaking the way in which they're currently reporting stuff?
It won't be tweaked. I should begin by responding by saying that if there's been any success on my work, it's this issue. Countries are moving in the direction of not creating a complete wealth data set, because that will be a long time coming. Many of these goods are very hard to agree on the prices of. So there is a problem there. But the point about the wealth is that the national accountant should, like a company has the balance sheets. We need balance sheets for nations in the sense that what did the nation's wealth consist of? What the assets that they command over last year compared to this year. Now, even the ONS is now moving in the direction of creating parallel accounts of natural capital. Now, the reason it's really important is the following. The United Nations Environment Programme has, UNEP in Nairobi, has been publishing a sequence of documents. 2018 was the last one, on the wealth of nations, changing wealth of nations, about 140 countries. Very crude estimates, of course, because they have the produced capital and human capital, they lifted straight out of the World Bank, IMF, OECD publication. That's for sure, because those are routine ones. But they have to create the accounts on natural capital, for which they use, say, oil and natural gas, forest, but only for timber. So a very restricted set of things. Some fisheries, but fishery data are extremely sparse, because governments don't collect data on stocks of natural capital. Companies do, what furniture they have, what machinery they own, and so forth. But all that, the stocks that the country has, is not recorded. So it's the beginning. It's the first approximation to these. And what was interesting in their time series of what they estimated physical capital, produced capital per capita, the trend of that, human capital per capita and natural capital per capita in the manner that I mentioned, which are very, very sparsely documented. What they found over a period 1992 to 2010, it's a startling one. Per capita produced capital doubled globally. This is the global average, okay, aggregated. Per capita human capital, health, education, increased by about 20%. But natural capital per capita declined by 40%. Now, that decline mostly will not be recorded in the GDP because it's gross. So if you look at the first two curves, you say, gosh, this has been a phenomenal gain. They're doing well. So much more of physical capital, so much more of human capital. But what's gone missing in the data, in the official data, are the natural capital one. And that's what's being now counted. And a number of countries are moving in that direction. Costa Rica is, China, Canada, New Zealand. I was in New Zealand 2 years ago with Carol. And they are moving actively to creating a parallel set of accounts. And I think the issue is not to bang on about how awful GDP is. GDP is extremely important for short-run macroeconomic management. No question about it. It's giving you a sense of the size of the economy, the human economy. But if it doesn't include the dependence of that size on Mother Nature, which is, of course, without it, we're all sunk. So we need both.
Although one key difference would surely be that if I increase consumption, say, in the UK, but by depleting a rainforest in, like, the Amazon, then normally we would just ignore what goes on offshore. Whereas it sounds like for every country in the world, they should be keeping some account of the depreciation of assets on a global basis, not just within the borders. That's
exactly right?
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Of course, in an ideal set of prices, if you pay for the rainforest depletion when you import the material, you will have covered yourself. And if they, in turn, use that money to balance their book by saying, well, we have depleted our natural capital by so much, have we created the corresponding type of natural capital, maybe, or produced capital if it's substitutable in some sense, to see whether our wealth as a result of burning down an acre of the rainforest was a good thing or a bad thing.
Right. But that actually brings me to this sort of how does this change the way we think about policy? Because somebody has to be taking into account those depreciated assets in that case, and the prices don't exist in the world because these are not tradable assets. So someone has to be also evolving the valuations in order for the policymakers to take that into consideration. Yes. So how, given the kinds of frameworks we have for policy making, do you see that potentially working? And do you think there's progress on that going on to parallel the measurement progress that you were talking about?
Yes, there's been a progress. And this is the one area which has caught on, as it were, because I think there's been so much of attention given to it. There's no straightforward answer because they have to come with examples. So let me give you 3 examples very quickly, okay? First one, not all of these goods are non-tradable. So for example, suppose in a poor country, and I keep on harping back to poor countries because in some sense this depletion of natural capital is really hurting poor countries. So the growth process that, say, the IMF, World Bank, OECD have encouraged countries to pursue have been on the whole extremely, I think, of course there have been good things, goes without saying, more education, people live longer and so forth. We all know that, but the natural, the ecosystem basis of their lives has been much damaged. So suppose you create a shrimp farm in a mangrove in a tropical poor country. And you're encouraged to do that because, of course, WTO tells them that, trade is very good. It's good for you to export because with the export revenue you can then invest and so forth. Okay, that's a standard kind of argument. And about the only things they can do is exporting primary products, the poorest countries. Okay, suppose it's a shrimp farm. Now, one of the things about shrimp farms is it destroys quite a bit of the neighboring ecosystems. So that's a fact. Let's say, just for the sake of argument, let's suppose a 30% decline in productivity of the neighboring fishery as a consequence of the salinization, the putrefaction of the water. Now, that damage will typically not be included, will not be calculated when the shrimp farmer exports his shrimp. So the export price will not reflect the cost of production because of the, as I say, damaged mangroves, which have high productivity. So what does that mean? That means that the exporting country is actually transferring wealth to the importing country, which happens to be rich, which is really perverse. So wealth accounting is very useful because basically this damage, which is not being reflected in the price, is a way of saying the point that you were raising, namely, they're transferring wealth to the importing country because we're enjoying the shrimp for cheap. Okay. So what should they do? Clearly, they ought to have an export tax and compensate for the damage. No single poor country is going to want to do that for loss of markets because the importer will go to somewhere else, let's say. So the right thing would be for them to cooperate, the exporters. So I would like to think that African countries now ought to cooperate to say that, look, this exporting of primary products really has harmful consequences to our own ecosystems, damages some of the poorest people in our society. And so we ought to collect for that when we do the exporting. So that's one kind of thing. A second example would be that's going to be the second and third are tricky ones, and they're the ones you wise man that you are, picked on them as for. The open oceans is one. That's a pure public good, and it's an open access resource. Nobody owns beyond the 200-mile EEZ. That's one category of, and it's an asset. It's a huge asset. I mean, without the oceans, we are sunk. If life ends there, we are absolutely dead. Life won't be dead, but humans will be dead. And then there are the tropical rainforests. They too are a gigantic public good, global public good, but they are within national jurisdiction, which is the example that you mentioned. Now, if it's a national jurisdiction, they assume, for the sake of argument, that the country which houses a rainforest is has a good governance. Okay, we economists like to assume things, so suppose there is good governance, okay? Then they could legitimately say that this is a public good that we own, global public good. So why should we pay for the whole world's benefit? So we need to develop, and our models are telling us, because the World Bank says, that transforming some of it into cattle farm is a good idea because there's demand for beef, foreign exchange, and so forth. So, or soybeans or whatever. Okay. So the right thing here would be, instead of we moaning about the disappearance of is for the global community to pay for the ecosystem services, which happens within countries. In this country, there's payment for ecosystem services. In France, there is payment for ecosystems that are managed. You know, if my land benefits Philippe, I say to Philippe, by the way, you know, you're benefiting. You know, how about some? And if the property rights are so devised, you pay me to preserve it. And if I threaten to destroy it, you say, no. Can I give you something, Partha, on an annual basis for its protection? So that would come. That would be the natural thing on international policy. That could be, we are looking at billions. Where did you get that? One answer would be to charge for the use of the oceans, international community, because it's a global public good. It's owned by nobody, and therefore it's owned by everybody. So currently we don't have the energy or the self-confidence to create an international agency to look into this possibility of. We did that with the World Bank after the war. When I say we, our previous generation had the vision to create the World Bank, IMF, United Nations, the whole lot, because they were due to supply public goods. But here is a case where we should charge for the use of all these trillions of dollars of merchandise that sail across the Pacific and Atlantic. And we could charge rent for it. We could be generating billions, which could be used for Lord knows how many things, among other things, of course, payment for the preservation of the rainforest.
But an implication of this is that we really do have to raise our game on governance. I mean, if we look at progress since, say, the Second World War, huge progress on provision of education, healthcare, other areas where building the state capacity within defined jurisdictional boundaries has turned out to be a very viable model. I'm not even sure we give the world a B- when it came to globally cooperating on any major issues.
That's right.
So is that a case of you hint at the possibility of a new institution or new institutions that could regulate these large global public goods? How optimistic do you feel about that? Do you think the argument is well established now to a point where we hoping people take it on? I mean, we're not at this moment in time living in a world where global cooperation is at its finest moment. That comes and goes. So how do you see all of that?
Well, I'm giving those two examples, the two global public goods example, because you hinted at it. That's why. Domestically, there is an enormous amount that needs to be done in terms of changing the government structure, the economic calculation. How well is the argument established? Now, I should say, we economists we may be lousy on many things, but on some things we are pretty reasonable, which is when we prove a theorem, it's a theorem. And that's established. I mean, I don't care if the theorem has been passed by the referees and people like Philippe and yourself, then that's established. So the idea of looking at wealth, that's incontrovertible. That's just exactly right. And yet, of course, every agency has its own measure. So the UNDP has the Human Development Index, and it's completely arbitrary, just picking up a few items from the air, putting them together and saying that's human development. And that's the kind of practice I hope will disappear slowly, because an institution might say, I'm interested in only one facet of wealth. That's for sure, that can happen. But then it should do it in conformity with the way wealth is estimated. One of the problems I've recently discovered, the ONS in this country was, I mean, the gentleman who was talking to pointed out, is that national income statisticians worry about ownership. They feel that an asset is to be claimed will enter will have the status of an asset if there is an ownership that you can, firm, company, person, or whatever. And I think that's a mistake because of the examples we just now mentioned. Say the atmosphere, that's an asset into which we use as a sink for, say, carbon emissions, if nothing else. So it's the carbon emission is the flip side of the wealth we are talking about. So it's the negative price, because it's a pollutant. So it's not owned by anybody. But the fact is that we all make use of it, so it's part of our wealth. Not the whole of it is part of it, but we do have a theory of public goods, so we can assign the value of the extent to which France has access, that's not ownership is not the right, has access to the atmosphere as a sink for France's pollutant. India can do the same, and so forth. And should be included in the assets. Because as the quality of the asset deteriorates, then of course you'll see it's a global asset, but it's a bad, it's the deteriorating one. So Canaro and I pointed out that we did some work together. He didn't really develop the theory so much. That was done earlier by Carl-Johan Mehler and myself. But we did some applied work estimating wealth in 5 countries we chose. I think it was China, India, Venezuela, USA, and it'll come back to me, Brazil. We looked for a period of time, and we wanted to see whether wealth per capita had increased or declined over a period that we studied. And there, what we did with carbon was to assign, to say that if let's say you take $100 a ton as a shadow price. We were not committed to a number, but we were just borrowing it from estimates that were around. Shadow cost, social cost of carbon. Then each year you look at the global emissions, and that will be the deterioration in the asset in question. But the amount you assign to, say, China would be the shadow price. It would not be the $100, but it'll be proportional of $100, depending on the size of Chinese economy relative to the world economy. It's a crude way of doing it, but it's a pretty nifty crude, if you see what I mean. It's the right thing because GDP and emissions seem to be, if not proportionate, certainly an increasing function, so you can do it. So there are ways in which you can handle the issue of ownership, the fact that it's not owned by anybody, but the fact that it's accessed does contribute to the wealth. That we should bear in mind.
So that actually brings me nicely to my next question, which was to sort of link concerns about biodiversity with debates about climate change. The two are in many ways distinct, but also related.
Yes. Yep.
And if one thinks, of course, the glass sometimes half empty or half full, but many countries have made pledges of the form of net zero by some suitable date, 2050 or whatever.
Yeah.
And using that as a kind of guiding light for policy. Is there something that could be similarly thought about as a guiding set of principles that could actually galvanize real public action in the sphere of biodiversity? Or is it too an amorphous set of things to reduce it down to say we're going to achieve the equivalent of a net zero by a certain date, and then from that would follow a series of policy interventions that we might think are needed to get to that goal?
Thank you. I'm very glad you asked me this question because it's sort of typical of you. It sort of opens up a huge set of interrelated matters of real substance here. So you're absolutely right. These two sort of are not the same, but they influence each other. How do they influence each other? Of course, climate change is likely to shift if nothing else, shift the location of the distribution of biota. And if you destroy the rainforest, it'll have a huge impact on the climate. Now, I think one weakness of the literature on the economics of climate change, and one reason it got so much attention quickly enough once economists moved in on the subject, is that it saw the conventional human economy shorn of nature, but grafted on it a climate model. So it was, roughly speaking, the idea was that there was a byproduct of output, which is a bad. And that bad has consequence, and that you try and estimate how bad it is. And otherwise you do economics. No. And it also led to the idea that you could substitute your way out by going for clean energy. And so there's a technological fix to the problem. So if you invest in clean energy and you move to zero net, as you say, and have the energy required, that may require 2%, 3% of GDP each year, but otherwise life is fine. You can go for growth GDP. Remember, nobody ever questioned the sanctity of growth of GDP in the entire literature on climate change, and for that reason. Now, the reason that's really quite dangerous is that climate regulation, and by that I mean nature's climate education, regulation, not climate regulation by governments, I mean nature's, the service that Mother Nature provides in recycling carbon, is just one of the very many uncountable number of processes that hang together. Decomposition of waste is one, which is incredibly important. Without it, we'll be dead. When animals die, they get recycled in so many ways. When leaves fall, they also get recycled, they turn into soil and so forth. Pollination is one. Nitrogen fixation is one. Natural cleansing of water in the wetlands is another. So all the services the fungi do, and the bacteria and also animals, they're missed out, and those services are complementary to one another. So it's like a house of cards we are playing with. Of course, nature is pretty robust, so it's not going to fall like that. But if we try hard enough, we can do it, which we are trying to do with climate change. And in the case of biodiversity, you see, my review is called the Review of Biodiversity because economics of biodiversity, because that's what I was asked to write on. But pretty quickly, I knew I wasn't going to write on biodiversity. It's actually, there's very little said about biodiversity other than a couple of appendices. The reason is that biodiversity is a characteristic of ecosystems. And what I had in mind was to convert economics to take nature as regard it as a capital asset, so the attention should be on ecosystems as capital assets. So we look for the productivity of ecosystems. We ask, is this wetland productive now, or is it sick? And by the way, biologists would use expressions like, this is an unhealthy fishery or unhealthy wetland. And by that they mean it's not functioning in the way you would expect if it were healthy, doing all the stuff like the birds and the insects that inhabit it, which then pollinates the neighboring farm, and then the water that flows through it, which is cleansed and then feeds the city with water, as had happened in the New York City in the Catskills, if you remember. So in some sense, the economics of biodiversity, at least my review, it's easier than the economics of climate change. Because what it says is, look, we just are missing out a whole bunch of assets which we haven't thought about. And we should think about them in the same way as we do other assets. The only thing is they don't have markets, so we better start thinking about how to price them and estimate the benefits they yield, and therefore the returns on investment in those assets. So now, of course, that's easier said than done, and that's why it's a 600-page document, because there's a lot of work already that's been done. Huge amounts of work, published work, on trying to estimate the productivity of different types of ecosystems, and of course they're going to be site-specific. So a shrimp farm here is different from a shrimp farm there, a wetland here is not the same as a wetland there. They need separate investigation, but you can do that. Mangroves, for example, there have been wonderful estimates of the value of mangroves, particularly in the Indian the eastern seaboard, because there are at least three things mangroves do for you, or humans. Well, one is, of course, the carbon it stop, the wood. Another is and of course, villagers make use of it. Another is a nursery for fish. And a third is protection against storms. And each of these can be valued and have been in a very, very nifty way, because you have lots and lots of villages, and you can see the damage a storm has inflicted on them, and related to the density of the mangroves in the neighborhood, and you can get some sense of it. So you can then estimate the return on mangroves in the same way as you do it. So it requires work, and you're not going to have those prices given to you by looking at a book, or the trade statistics. It needs work, but the fact is, conceptually, we're not embarking on something entirely new. We're looking at assets, which get missed out in the weakness is in the way we have practiced economics. The weakness is not in economics. Economics is pretty good. It's pretty.
That leads me nicely to my last question, and then we'll throw it open, which is, as you know, the annual review of economics is widely read by both practicing economists, young economists, PhD students looking for good ideas. And I'm always struck, I think in mathematics, they have this list of the great unsolved problems that people should be working on, I suppose, if they want to win Fields medals or whatever. But if you were to articulate what are the issues that you feel are being underattended to by mainstream or any kind of economics, do you have? I'm not going to ask you for your list of the 5 big unsolved issues, but maybe you could just talk a little bit about the directions of research that you, if you're given this opportunity to speak to young economists, you would be steering them towards, that come out of what we've been talking about in our conversation.
Gosh, that's really hard. I'm going to duck out of this one, largely because in some sense, I don't see a conceptual barrier which is preventing us from dealing with the human economy in the way we should deal with it. It was an error on our part. Not too much of an error, as I was suggesting, say, 70 years ago. Except for local communities, by the way. There's always local communities which have gone under through the destruction of their own ecosystems. It could be because of population pressure. It could be mismanagement of the resource. I'm talking now globally only. But I think one area which, when I say it's not so much unsolved, but one aspect of the problem which we haven't touched upon here. I talked about wealth, and I talked about wealth per capita because that's a very natural way of thinking, because we look at the representative person and we say, is he or she wealthier today than she was before, that sort of thing. But it's not absolutely obvious that per capita is what you're after. And I don't mean this distribution issue. That's the easy bit I'm talking now about, whether it should be per capita at all. And that's because population varies. And one thing I think we economists have been really naughty about is keeping demography out of the subject. And I think that's been a big mistake. And I've tried to rectify it in my review. There are at least 2 chapters which go into it. Because the pressure that has been built on Mother Nature through our great success, as it were, is the total demands that we make on her. That exceeds her capacity to supply it, meet that demand on a sustainable basis, and which is why they're going down in quality, the biosphere. But it also depends on not just the per capita, but also the total demand. So numbers matter enormously. And population, the total population in 1950 was about 2.5 billion. Today it's 7.8 billion, and we're moving towards 10.2, 10.5 in 2100 if we go by the United Nations population projections. And they're, by the way, really reliable people. They're the best there are in the population division of the UN in New York. They have a pretty good track record. And it's not just global population. If currently, and this is, you said, really serious work that can be done, well, here is one. Because it's unmined, and unmined by the economics profession, and therefore a smart graduate student should jump into it, if applied work. Africa is the test case in many ways, the subcontinent of Africa, because currently population is about 1.1 billion, approximately that. And the UN projection is 3.8 billion in 2100. And by the way, they know that people do respond to policies and so forth. So it's not these are not just looking backwards and then extrapolating. They have a good Bayesian models to work with. And that's a nearly fourfold increase of a community of a subcontinent where the per capita income is a quarter of the per capita global income. So they're dirt poor. Totally, they have no. In the aggregate, Africa bears no responsibility for climate change or anything because they're peanuts, about 3-4% of global GDP. What should worry about, and that's where the graduate student may have, is the future of Africans. My students in Africa and their children and their grandchildren and their grandchildren, because with so far removed they are from the demographic transition of a kind that, say, Bangladesh has successfully made, by the way. And look where she is now, getting into the lower middle income category. The combination of the effect of fertility, the relationship between fertility targets in a community, the externalities that are involved in additional births, and the feedback of the states of the local ecosystem on the need for children and so forth. That entire category of issues is missing in economics. The economic demography that we have essentially sees the household in a market economy, and it's essentially a trade-off between quality and quantity of children, and that's nothing wrong with that, but that's not how it is seen in rural, in the poorest world. And in some sense, in my sense, that some of the most exciting economics that we can do now really should be in studying the poorest societies, because the customs differ, the norms differ, and so forth. And then you try and find a way through it to see that, well, norms are not written in stone. Norms change very fast, and we've seen it in our own lives. And also, behavior. Here's another issue, which is our demand structure is built on the idea that we are the second set of issues, which are connected now. Our demand side of things is built on the assumption that we are atomistic. We have a household, we have a demand function, or utility function, and then subject to a budget constraint, you make demands, you aggregate the demands, and our finance ministries run with them and estimate expenditure functions and so forth. But so much of our consumption are social consumption. That is to say, we care about what others think we are doing, and we look to others when we choose our own thing. Look at our clothes. We're clothing, men in particular. We don't have much variation there. We're sort of equilibrated in a particular style of, likewise in food and so forth. So and then also in reproductive behavior, there's a the interesting empirical set of studies on the social nature of reproductive behavior, that is, the influence of others on ones and so forth. And so the demand structure, these things can be pulled together to give a much more, not only accurate, but humane, if I may say so, analysis of the human predicament, if you like. And I think we in economics are missing them out altogether. And what we have done is we've cornered ourselves into looking at an atomistic world where individuals are almost solipsistic, essentially. And yet then we worry about distribution. So there's tons of work on distribution, that's for sure. Income distribution, wealth distribution, you name it. But it's embedded in a world where you might say, well, what do I care? I mean, you have to be super moral to start thinking about distribution where you're actually thinking about completely atomistic people. So I think these two would be not so much unsolved problems, because I don't think they're beyond the reach of really good graduate students. And obviously some financial support to do some field work, that's for sure. But the field work could be done with really good anthropologists and particularly demographers. Demography is a sort of a dying subject around here. And that's really I think it's an insult to our intelligence.
Excellent, thank you very much. So we have a few more minutes, so if there are any questions, who would like to ask the first question here? So we'll go here and here, and then I'll keep my eye out for other ones. Yeah.
Thank you. Professor Dasgupta, I'm Arnab Ghosh. I run a think tank in India called the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. Thanks for a very enlightening conversation. I had two questions. I'll at least pose one, and if I have time, I'll pose the second one. It goes back to the issue of stock and flows. On one hand, let's take a country like Costa Rica, right? A stock of rainforests that could potentially derive value from. Now, when we talk about the climate change issue and the issue of net zero, there's a lot of conversation about how much will be zero and how much will be net. Right? And therefore, there's a lot of resistance in some quarters in actually offsetting one country's emissions by planting trees somewhere else. Now, the conundrum that arises as a result is that a country like Costa Rica has a stock, but there's a difference between the valuation of that stock and the derived value from that stock, which is a flow. Now, if we don't have that trade of offsets, then the stock is just a stock. And a poor country would say, well, then what do I get from preserving this forest? So I want to get your thoughts on this distinction between valuation and derived value.
Yeah, it's fine. If the country recognizes that the value of that stock is not entirely bounded within the nation, and obviously has the semblance of a public good, we've already discussed that earlier. They really ought to be compensated. They have every right to say, look, we're preserving it, but we're dealing it to the rest of the whole world. And I think there is a good deal of truth in that, and that's one of the things that in my review, that we need to pay for that. But you asked a slightly different question, which is very related but extremely important, which is what about offsetting? I've real difficulty with that offsetting issue, and the real difficulty lies out of the fact this, again, one of the complaints I have about the economics of climate change is thinking in terms of only carbon. But carbon in Costa Rica and the manifestation of that carbon in Costa Rica is a hell of a lot different from a manifestation of carbon in, say, in Siberia, let's say, just for the sake of argument. So now, in principle, you could say, well, look, 1 acre of rainforest of carbon that is embedded in a hectare of forest in Costa Rica is equal to, 500 acres of carbon in Siberia or something. I mean, I don't know if there is something like that, but when you go into that kind of reasoning, you really lost the argument. These stocks are indivisible types of stocks. I mean, they can be destroyed, that's for sure, but the value has an indivisibility to it. It's not substitutable that easily. You can do up to a point, but now in the Amazon, for example, the very straightforward calculations that the ecologists have made is that another third or so of the Amazon going down will really transform it into a savanna. And no amount of carbon offsetting is going to do that for you. I mean, it's a specificity, location specificity, arising out of the fact that the whole thing is a network. So it's not exactly just a carbon down under in the soil. It just extends over miles and miles of fungi and so forth, okay? So, yeah, if we start taking as one extreme the idea that these are non-transferable assets, the benefits that people get comes out of them being there, then the question is who is benefiting and how do we compensate for there? And I think we come back to the point I was making previously.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So question here, then I'll travel to the back. Yeah.
Professor Dasgupta, fantastic to hear about the beginnings of your work on biodiversity back into the 70s, very interesting. My name is Nick Robbins, I'm a professor in practice on sustainable finance here at the LSE, at the Grantham Research Institute. And just to signal that your work on economics of biodiversity has had real impact, in the sense we've just finished a study group with about 25 central banks around the world on looking at biodiversity loss and financial stability. And that's led about 100 central banks to recognise that dealing with nature-related risks is part of their business. So that's real traction, I think, in terms of your work. I'd be interested just in the thoughts. I mean, you signalled in your report the importance of fixing the financial system here, and just some of your reflections from your long looking at this. Some of the signals and advice you would give to people in the financial system about how they can grapple with this issue.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, this is going to be a tough one to answer because it's a tough question, of course. But I should say right at the beginning that some of the biggest support, the question initial, the huge amount of support I've had subsequent to this publication has been from the financial sector. I was really surprised. But I was surprised only because I was ignorant. I shouldn't have been surprised because it's the risks that companies face, investors face, particularly over the long supply chain. What's happening in the supply chain is real, and it was explained to me. I had the benefit of advice in my advisory panel. Had people like Sir Roger Gifford, the late Roger Gifford, who gave me enormous amount of help in bringing me up to speed in trying to understand what ethical investment might mean from his standpoint. So the uncertainty we're talking about arises out of the usual problems of moral hazard and adverse selection that an investor, I'm talking now about the investor and the person who's managing the portfolio, we have to separate those out, okay? And the company has, let us say, contract out with a supplier, cocoa beans, let's say, just what they say, cocoa, primary products which end up in our supermarkets. And it's a long chain from here. And so the support of the ecosystem there is extremely important here. The only problem is there is a lot of leakage along the way. And also, if that supply source dries up, you might be able to move to another one. Now, that probably was pretty true, fairly true 40, 50 years ago. It's becoming less true now because of the crowdedness again. The other thing is that you have other companies who also import from neighboring ecosystems from the one you are. And they're connected, so the risks that I face, or this company faces, are correlated with the risks the others face. So you have a double whammy. You have incomplete markets because of these externalities, leading to overextension of the supply side, of the ecosystem supplying the primary product. And on top of that, the risks that are now you're facing as a result of the decline in the productivity of your source of supply are correlated with the others. So it seemed to the solution solution is one way most economists would suggest would be that disclosure is a way of trying to substitute for the fact that markets are missing. And we do that with food. Today, foods that we buy, you have a long list of stuff, what's in it, because we don't know what's in it unless we are told. So, calories, fat content, minerals, and you name it, salt, and so forth and so on. Why are they doing that? It's in order to stabilize the demand side of things. We feel we're buying the right product. To the extent that consumers of products are now not only thinking about their own health, but the health of the ecosystems from which are supplying the goods they're consuming, to that extent there will be a pressure on the firms. The question is, what can they do about it? The correlation means that insurance is not a way out because they're correlated. So the natural thing would be for the companies themselves to get together and then insist that governments regulate them in the form of full disclosure, or as much as possible, of the state of the entire supply chain as to what's happening at everything. That seems to me the only way out, because the market's not going to solve this. And I think on the whole, I've had a very reasoned, nobody from the sector that these Zoom meetings that I've had, I've never had any objection to this. They said that reads right to them.
Great. So we have time for 2 more questions. So I'd seen Chiara and then Jesse, and then we'll do them together, and then you can.
Sure, of course.
Okay, so.
Try and be quick about it. Thank you for your conversation. So I'm Chiara Satis, I'm one of the PhD students here, and one of the parts of your conversation was aiming at public goods and payment for ecosystem services, and you make the case that people can bargain over that. And that's very compelling, but it also relies on the fact that both parties have power and are informed about the value of what they're providing. It seems to me that in a lot of cases when we're thinking about deforestation or when we're thinking about overfishing, one of the parties doesn't really know the value of what they're providing and has really low bargaining power with respect to the destroyer of the resource, if you wish. So is the argument here that the government should step in more and make people understand the value of the services they're providing? Or is it more about making sure that these groups of people can organize and can bargain towards getting these payments that they deserve?
That's a tricky one, largely because it depends on the country you have in mind or society you have in mind. I don't think the government has a clue in Africa, in any African country, because they're so distant from the people they're supposed to be looking after and representing. The world's poorest have no doubt about the value of their local ecosystems. So nobody's going to teach them that kind of. On the other hand, we need to be educated about what we unconsciously very often do even to the public parks we visit. Never mind, these sort of. So, it depends. I think it depends a heck of a lot. In an open society, of course, you have not the government. You have plenty of NGOs, essentially, WWF and so forth. And in open societies, that's exactly what should happen, and has happened. Much of the awareness of nature has come from the BBC, Attenborough's programs and so forth, not government. So it's not, it depends a bit on the example in question.
Okay, Jesse, and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you very much. I'm Jesse Norman. I'm a Member of Parliament. I was a Treasury Minister when the Treasury commissioned your excellent work, Professor, and I'm very honoured that we were able to do so, and I thank you for it very much. There's a tremendous kind of tendency in many of these debates to say, but we more or less understand the theoretical position, and if we could control for all of the issues we're talking about, then we'd be fine. The real problem lies in governance and politics and how hopeless the politicians are, and how lacking in courage and all that. And I don't mean to defend politicians at all, because I think they often are hopeless and being all worse. But I do just want to ask you a question about something you said, which is you said you thought that policy, particularly interesting areas of policy, we focus on obviously the least well off, and obviously the long-standing strands of public policy reflection and rules the question that we'll be thinking about those folks. Do you think it's possible that policy that is focused on those people might come out with rebarbative conclusions as regards climate change or biodiversity? And what's the in-principle way of addressing that issue, given that we don't want to get into the business of accusing those people of false consciousness, I take it. Or do we, and do you really think that actually we need to be benignly dictatorial in order to protect their longer-term interests, or the longer-term interests of their grandchildren?
Gosh.
Nice, easy question to finish on.
Yeah. I wouldn't even begin to know how to answer your question. I'm going to be sneaky like most economists are. I'm very much an economist, so I will be sneaky, but shifting it slightly away. I didn't really, my review right from the preface onwards was addressing not governments, but the citizen. Because it seems to me that it's the aggregate of citizens' worries which need to be marshaled through the political leadership. I don't blame governments, because at least in open societies like here, governments constantly worry about what the citizens want. So it's not bad, constantly. The question is, are we wanting the right thing? And in the sense of, given that we are here for some years and then we have our children will take over and our grandchildren will take over. And there's one universal truth seems to be that we do care about our children, our own children, I mean. And the problems arise because we don't care about the others' children, and the others don't care about the others' children. And these externalities create real serious difficulties. And economics can play a bad role there. So I think it's really, it's for us to insist on, say, educational reform. And it was not a surprise to me. I mean, it was a pleasant surprise to me, but it was a suggestion from my review that we need to educate, the educational program ought to have nature studies from primary school onwards and not end at primary school. Now, it's just entered as a special paper in this country for GCSEs, and it will in a couple of years' time. But special paper means special paper, so it might be seen as a soft option, who knows. But it's a beginning. I think we really, that's how I would see it. I would see that it is really our job in those societies where we can express ourselves, and here we can, to coordinate with the help to put pressure on. Other than that, I'd be very hard pressed to respond to your very interesting question. Thank you very much.
Well, it's time to draw matters to a close, but I think that what I take away from your last comment is that in a way you're playing a role not just as an economist in all of this, but as a member of civil society, that we all are, as academics or policymakers or others, contributing to the climate of opinion, and that itself ultimately is how things change. And I think you must be right that the route to change is to have a much wider appreciation of the issues that you've been talking about this evening. And your review, I hope, will, in years to come, be considered a landmark in really shifting the direction of policy and thinking. It's been a real privilege to spend time with you as ever, Partha, and I'm sure that everyone else in the room feels the same. And thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much.